first book. But the confusion with terrorism and jihad, and jihad, which is not a word which necessarily correlates with terrorism, it's a concept. Just your comment on that and how the misinterpretation and disconnect between those two.
Wow, let me do this quickly. Okay. I think when I was writing this, I got pretty upset at the constant use of the term jihadists to describe terrorists. And the reason I did that was because this again was a symptom of the kind of thing I was talking about, where we do this projection of ourselves onto other people's history. Holy war, jihad's usually translated as holy war in media now. For those of you who don't speak Arabic, holy war in Arabic would be harb al-muqaddasa, which if you're really listening closely doesn't sound like jihad. And doesn't appear in any Islamic text. Like, it's just not an Islamic concept. Holy war, of course, is a medieval Christian concept. It was a doctrine that the church used, particularly during the time of the Crusades. And the concept of holy war was that it was the believer's prerogative to declare war on the unbeliever merely because they were an unbeliever, in order to convert them or vanquish them. Jihad literally means struggle. And as that term implies, that can apply to just about anything. You can struggle in all sorts of ways. It does have a military component, but let's, for the sake of taking a shortcut, look at the most aggressive formulation of jihad in Islamic history. And that was the formulation of the Umayyad Empire from about 650 to 750, around those years. What the Umayyads did was embark upon an incredibly effective campaign of military expansion, of imperial expansion. They went out and conquered huge parts of the world and surprised everybody, because nobody thought that Arabs could fight. And here they just burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and suddenly they reached as far as France, until they were defeated there in 732. Their concept of war was a perpetual one. That is, we'll just keep conquering territory till we get as much as we can. But it still wasn't holy war, because they didn't care what people that they ruled believed. So, as long as they were in charge, they didn't care. As long as they could collect tax, you could believe what you want. In fact, they ruled over as a minority for almost all of their existence. In fact, I think for all of their existence. They didn't even really care that much about how life went on underneath them. When they conquered Syria, all areas of governance, except for the treasury, were conducted by Syrian Greeks in Greek. Once it got to the treasury, that was different. They didn't know what was going on. But the rest of it, they didn't really... What they were concerned about was imperialism.
That's because you can't trust Greeks with money, is it?
Oh, well... well, maybe you can. Right, yeah. Want to talk about the EU? Yeah. They were just so far ahead of their time. So, I mean, even that, and that's the most aggressive and by no means uncontestable form of military jihad. Even that, it's really imperialism, it's not holy war. Terrorism, by contrast, from an Islamic point of view, if you want to look at this from an indigenously Islamic perspective, terrorism and jihad are really very different categories. Jihad is something that the government does, either as a means of self-defence or, in the more aggressive formulations of it, as a means of imperial expansion. But nonetheless, it's the government that does it, and it is waged with governmental authority. Terrorism, by definition, is something that non-government actors do as a form of rebellion in order to create a revolution. They're just very different things, and they're treated differently in Islamic law. And one of the things that I got very excited was reading this really dense 400-page book on the medieval Islamic law of rebellion. I know, how exciting am I? And one of the things that was really fascinating about it was that medieval Islamic jurists were actually quite lenient towards rebels. And the reason they were was because they thought if you didn't give rebels concessions, they would have no incentive to stop their rebellion. So if you just said we're going to kill every rebel, then they'll just keep fighting, because if you if they get captured or surrender, they'll be killed anyway. So the rebels got a whole lot of concessions. That is, the caliph had to treat them in a certain way, had to negotiate with them first, had to wouldn't hold them accountable for property that they destroyed in the course of their rebellion, so on and so forth. However, there were certain kinds of rebels who were not entitled to that treatment. And they were rebels who went beyond the pale by killing people who were not soldiers of the government, or using rape as a weapon, and so on. Those people were not called rebels. They were called muharibun, which in medieval terms it probably means like bandits or brigands. And that was the highest crime. If you committed that, the caliph could do basically whatever he wanted to do. That is the concept that is far more akin to terrorism. And I guarantee you, every time you use the word jihadist to describe terrorists, you are really playing into their hands, because it confers on them a legitimacy that they don't have and that they don't deserve. If you were able, and I know this would be a very difficult thing to do, particularly at this late stage, if you were able instead to describe them as muharibun, that would have a totally different resonance. It would be much more Islamically accurate, and it would be delegitimizing. Unfortunately, you would have to teach every politician that word and convince them to use it, and that's not likely to be the case. But nonetheless, there is a conceptual problem there.
But what you're saying is the frame is important and how you express it, because we're clearly not connecting number one or winning people over number two to an argument. There's no persuasive argument. We're all talking about different things.
Exactly. And the other problem that comes with that is you end up getting comments like from seriously influential leaders, prime ministers and presidents, on saying we need Muslims to relinquish jihad. Now that's a very difficult thing for a Muslim to do, because jihad is a concept that exists within the Islamic tradition. It has all sorts of meanings. Now you might know what you mean when you ask them to do that, but that doesn't mean that they do. So you may be asking them to relinquish a whole lot of stuff that actually to them is really important. Whereas if you ask them to relinquish banditry and brigandage, I wouldn't use those terms, but if you did, that would be a much easier conversation to have, because you're actually then speaking the same language. The miscommunication happens because A uses one word and B uses the same word, but they mean totally different things. And they use them, and no one appreciates that.
Just finally, before we open it up, and please ask questions, Waleed, do you think it's changed since there has been a change in regime in the United States? Has the attitudes changed? Is there more of a likelihood